Hello, everybody. Welcome. This is Sandy Lerman, and welcome to the Trauma-Informed Changemakers Book Club and Community special event. Tonight, we have an evening with Debbie Reber. Debbie is the author of one of my all-time favorite books called Differently Wired. It's about children who are differently wired. So we're going to talk about what that means here in just a minute. She's also an amazing podcaster. She has a beautiful, huge community of amazing people. And I've just been a fan for quite a long time. So I wanted to invite her on here to talk about the intersection between differently wired children and the topic that we all are really focused on here in our group is making sure that we're not only healing children who have already experienced childhood adversity and trauma, but also preventing trauma through brain-based, body-based, belonging-based parenting and teaching practices. So welcome, Debbie. Thank you so much for being here. I'm so excited to have you with us.
Thank you, Sandy. I'm happy to be here.
Yes, so let's dive right in. Let me talk about some ground rules. So Thor's joining us. He might stop over here, my dog Thor. As you're coming in, if you will pop in the chat where you are calling in from, who you are. Are you a parent? Are you an educator? Are you a parent coach? Are you a parent trainer? Are you an educational trainer in the schools? What is your role? Just so that we can give an idea of who's here tonight. And then we can tailor our questions and answer time to those kinds of topics. And then as we're going through, just keep yourself muted. Just turn your mute. Everybody turn yourself on mute. I might unmute some of you a little bit later, but I do want to watch the time and make sure that everybody, if anybody has a question, anybody that's here live will have an opportunity to ask that question. But we want to be mindful and make sure everybody gets a chance to do that. So what I'm going to have you do this time is in the chat, put your questions in the chat, and then I will just ask you to unmute if there's a question. If there are a couple questions that are similar, we might just pick one. So don't feel hurt if I don't choose you if there's a lot of similar questions. All right. So in the chat, we have Elena from Syracuse, New York, foster adoptive parent with 9 kiddos. Everybody else type in who you are and where you're from. Sydney is transitional kindergarten teacher from Long Beach, right down the street from Mona. We found out last time when Mona was here. All right, so just continue typing that in, and again, type your questions as we go. So let me get started. I have some juicy questions I've been really wanting to ask Debbie. So again, tonight we're going to be talking about differently wired children, children who are 2E, children who just don't seem to fit in those square boxes and round holes and the kind of standardized children, so to speak. So Debbie, if you'll explain to us, the title of your book is Differently Wired. Explain to us why you chose that title, what differently wired means, and maybe a little bit about what 2E children, what that means.
Sure. Yeah, so differently wired, that language was something I started playing with when I launched Tilt Parenting, or just started developing what Tilt Parenting would be, which came out a few years before the book. And I was really, first of all, trying to find language that was not deficit-based, that wasn't pathologizing neural differences, but rather was acknowledging that there are a lot of different ways that brains are wired, and that, different ways, unique ways that we all experience the world. And I like this idea of really looking at them all as a collective rather than ADHD over here, autism over there, learning disabilities here, sensory processing there, but rather kind of, what if we all kind of gathered together and looked at that there are so many different ways to navigate the world, to experience the world. And so this idea of being differently wired just really resonated. I can't say that I originated the term, but I certainly popularized it, because as soon as I started interviewing people for my podcast, I started like slipping it in, and then they started referring to differently wired kids, and it really resonated with parents because it felt so much more positive than so much of the disorder based language that's out there.
Yeah.
So
Yes, and
Yeah.
I love that. Let me just interrupt you because that I love that because my background is as a language educator. I taught kids from other countries. I was in the classroom for years, and it was so often that kids were diagnosed or labeled or put on an IEP as a special ed child, when really they just had a cultural difference, a language difference. Maybe they were differently wired. There were other things going on, and when there was this constant argument about, well, are they really supposed to be special ed? Are they really just supposed to be in the English language? So this is really a theme, I think, in a lot of circles where let's look at their strengths. Let's look at what they bring, right? So I love that.
Yeah.
And then explain
Yeah.
what TE means.
Yeah. So 2E is short for twice exceptional. And that is something I learned about because I'm raising a twice exceptional kiddo, now 17, but I'd never heard of this. So twice exceptionality is when someone is gifted, could be traditionally gifted with, the higher IQ, who would test well on the whiskey or one of those aptitude tests, or maybe creatively gifted in other areas, but they have this gifted piece and they also have some sort of neurodevelopmental difference. So could be gifted with autism, gifted ADHD, could be gifted autism, ADHD, sensory processing dyslexia. It could be all the things, right?
Right.
So it really, I love the language, and I actually really love twice exceptional people. I think, and these kids are just fascinating. But it's a really tricky presentation because often the giftedness can kind of mask the learning disabilities, the neurodevelopmental differences, because these kids often can overcompensate, and so we may not realize that that's going on until much later, or the learning disability masks the giftedness. So Scott Barry Kaufman, I don't know if you follow his work. He is has a PhD in neuroscience or psychology from Yale. He is a real thought leader in this space and in this movement. And he was in special ed until he was in high school. He was thought to be not smart, and
Like I'm
he was brilliant. Yeah, right. But we have a way of looking at gifted in this country and in our society, and so in his case, his learning disabilities masked, what was really going on, and he really had to advocate to get put in the classes he knew that he belonged in. And of course, his story is really inspirational to read about.
Yeah, and I think it's so important that we understand this because, as you know, we've got parents and teachers here tonight. And often, teachers come to the table with a certain lens. Parents come to the table with a certain lens. Special educators have a certain lens. So we have all these different ways of looking at children and assessing them, and they don't always match. And so things can get missed. And sometimes I think as parents, we just say, oh, well, the professionals told me that, and that's must be what it is. Or on the other hand, parents might be fighting to get a diagnosis or whatever. So it can definitely fall through the cracks. It can definitely be something that we don't notice, and then we just think, oh, it's a behavior issue, right?
Yeah, and I'll say too, this is especially true for kids of color, kids in more marginalized communities. It's the default mode wouldn't necessarily be, oh, this kid is probably gifted, and that's what's going on. So more often, it's going to be looked as a behavioral problem, or this is a challenging student in the classroom.
Or a learning disability or something. Yeah, and so when I taught English as a second language, which the word for that has changed over the years, but when I was teaching, it was ESL, and it was kids from other countries, Black and brown kids primarily. There were some Eastern European, but mostly Black and brown kids, and they were thought to be, oh, let's put them in the low class because they don't speak English, but some of them were very gifted and brilliant. And so they didn't test well, though. So what kinds of assessments are we using? Are we just basing it on our assumptions? What are we basing that on, right? So it's really hard to figure that out for some kids, especially if they have a different way of communicating or a different way of relating to the teacher and to their peers.
Yeah, absolutely.
Really important. So thank you for explaining that. So tell us a little bit about your story. Tell us about your son and maybe, whatever you want to share about why you decided, and like a little bit about your life before Tilt, and then everything Tilt parenting and everything since then, and what you're doing now.
Yeah, and I always like to say that this was not part of my career plan to be doing this. This was not what I wrote in my what do I want to be when I grow up. And
Exactly.
so yeah, I used to work in video production and kids television for years. And when I left that in 2003, I spent 10 years writing books for teenagers, mostly teen girls, kind of self-help empowerment books, and did a lot of content creation in that space. And then I had a child, and then everything kind of pivoted, and I fought that for a little while. I was like, no, I've got this whole other career. I'll do the parenting thing here, but I'm going to keep moving forward on, my teen advocacy work that I was doing. And a friend who's a child developmental psychologist, who was the one who kind of talked to me through my lowest moments as a parent. She always said to me, Debbie, I think that your journey as Asher's mom is more a part of your work in this world than you realize. Yeah. I was like, I'm not sure about that. But she was right. And as I, discovered over many years and many assessments and many messy breakups with preschools and elementary schools, that I was raising this neurodivergent, really complicated human, twice exceptional kiddo, and that this path was not going to be the path of ease that I had been anticipating. Or, I certainly thought I'm a pretty capable person. I know how to research, and I can, I can do this. Like, I'm really well equipped to parent and kind of knock it out of the park. And then, of course, I had this child who was like, no, actually, I have my own plans for you. So once I kind of realized, okay, this is a different path, I really was struck by just the lack of supportive, strengths-based resources in this space, how isolating my experience was as a parent, and, my husband as well, just often feeling like no one really gets what we're going through. We must really be miserable, like we're failing big time because everyone else seems to be doing a better job at this. Not being able to get clear answers, and then getting diagnoses, but that didn't actually do anything. Like, it didn't fix or address what was really challenging in our world. So in those early years, I was really just frustrated with how hard it was. And I kind of knew in the back of my mind, at some point, I need to kind of help other parents so they don't have to go through, what I'm going through right now. And so once I feel like I was kind of getting through the dark ages, as I call it, the dark years. Okay. And we have a kind of a crazy story, and I don't need to go into all of it, but we ended up, moving abroad when my child just turned 9. I homeschooled from 3rd through 8th grade. We lived in the Netherlands for all of that time. And so we had a chance to just throw out the rule book, and I had a chance to really lean into who this kid was and understand who Asher was on a different level. And I had my own kind of personal growth spurt. And so that's when I developed Tilt. And I've since then, I launched it in 2016. I created it as a podcast, as a community, as a resource for other parents who are raising a kid like mine, and who feels alone and isolated, so that they can kind of hopefully fast forward through the dark years.
Wow. And so your mess became your message, which is the path a lot of us who've been in the trenches with you can understand. Just by a show of hands, those of you who are here, those of you who have your cameras on, how many of you went through your own dark ages? Raise your hand if you're either in them or have been through them. Yeah. So a lot of us have experienced that as parents. Some of us as educators as well, but it's tough. It's tough when people don't get it. And you find yourself advocating for things, and you're supposed to be the parent. They're supposed to be the expert, but as the expert, they don't seem to know what they're doing, and it's frustrating. So thank you for taking that experience and making something beautiful out of it for your community and for the rest of us. So really appreciate that.
I
So
don't think I had a choice, but my
yeah,
brain was not going to let me not do it. So,
yeah, yeah. And I have a similar story too with my son. You know, it's yeah. I wasn't expecting it. And suddenly once I started doing parent coaching and working with parents, I realized that I had an expertise in extremely explosive and aggressive children. And that I didn't know that I was going to be signing up to be the expert in that. So just
yeah.
seems to be my little niche. So anyway, all right. So let's move into that then. Let's talk about trauma and sort of what my definition of what trauma is, because a lot of people look at it differently. Of course, we're talking about psychological, brain, body, and belonging. The feeling of having something that has either happened to you, either a one-time event or a developmental, ongoing situation that causes the child to feel threatened and to feel that their life is maybe even in danger, or to feel not having a safe attachment to the primary caregiver or caregivers, and then that becomes part of the brain wiring, becomes part of the nervous system. It becomes part of their way of acting in the world. And so we have kids who are very hyper vigilant, kids who are very easily startled and very reactive to what to us may seem to be very tiny little bit of stress, may cause a massive raging 5-hour meltdown for some of these children. The anxiety is through the roof with most of them. There may be other mental health diagnoses, other kinds of things going on. And yet, as you said, they bring beautiful gifts. They bring a beautiful way of seeing the world. My son is an amazing artist. I mean, he has so many strengths, so many beautiful qualities, but just struggled so much to connect, struggled so much to just even be in the world at times, shortly after his adoption. And so we went on a journey, a really difficult journey. But those of you who are here, so we have some adoptive and foster parents, we have some parents whose kids have had medical trauma, we have kids who've been through really abusive situations, maybe either before adoption, or sometimes I've had families I've worked with, they didn't realize that their parenting was abusive until after they understood that using a brain body belonging approach was going to be providing that attachment that was needed. So kids who have been through very strict disciplinary traditional type parenting can feel a sense of detachment, disorganized attachment, and trauma. And it really is trauma that goes undiagnosed sometimes. Sometimes it's diagnosed, and yet the diagnosis doesn't really give us a clear picture of everything that's caused that. So that's sort of my overview of what I see as trauma. There are big T traumas one time, and then there are little, there's this developmental trauma that's pervasive, complex, and really affects everything. So this is my question for you. This is the big question for the night. So we have children, because of their trauma that we're working with in this community, their brains are differently wired. Their nervous system is differently wired for fight, flight, or freeze. And often they don't do well in school either. And so often they have IEPs and other things going on. And then there are kids who are just born differently wired, and that's just part of their genetics or part of their makeup or part of their personality or part of whoever they happen to be. And they may experience trauma just because they're different and they don't fit in, and people are trying to put them in a box, and they feel anxious about that. So I just wanted to throw that out there and kind of get your thoughts on chicken and egg when it comes to trauma and differently wired children.
Yeah. It's such an interesting question, and I'm not an expert in kind of responding to the big T, little T traumas. I'm certainly learning a lot, through the work that I do and the experts that I get to talk with. I think what I see, and I'm really recognizing now, the more that I do this work and the more parents that I connect with, is how many differently wired kids do have traumatic experiences because of the way that they're wiring. School, there's so much school trauma because of things that happen when these kids are quite young. of course there's like seclusion and restraint, and though that kind of trauma is one thing, but um, there's also just the shaming, the kind of taking on this idea that I'm the bad kid, there's something wrong with me. Kind of, I've certainly seen and heard about and experienced some kind of educator endorsed kind of public shaming in classrooms. And when those kinds of things happen at early ages, certainly I think a lot of parents don't recognize or realize that that is something that is going to impact that child and stick with them, especially what happens during those formative years. So, certainly that kind of trauma, I think therapeutic trauma, behavioralist approaches to therapies, we're just learning more and more, I think, from the autistic community about ABA and harmful therapies that are overwhelmingly now kind of believed to be traumatic, yet that's still, I mean, that's a whole other conversation, but that's still
we can go there because that's what we talk about in this program. We talk about how to get rid of all of that, the sticker tablets, the rewards, consequences, all of this behaviorist.
Right.
That's just not, it just causes anxiety. It's really all it does. It doesn't cause kids to be motivated to do any better. You're rewarding kids with really calm nervous systems is what you're doing, right? So
yeah, and you're taking away I remember having a conversation with a therapist when Ash was quite young about something that happened that went wrong, and the yelling or whatever that came on the other end. And for me, I was so focused on like that behavior was uncomfortable for me. And she's like, but that response was totally appropriate to that situation. Like your child was processing that emotion. I'm like, oh yeah, like, but it's such a reframe, I think, for so many parents when we and teachers, and if we're focused on compliance or good behavior and calmness and all of those things, then yeah, for sure, it's all about managing what is probably that child's coping strategy, right? And that's what if you guys have read Dr. Barry Prezant's book, Uniquely Human, he talks a lot about that, the ways that, we're trying to kind of behavior kids out of certain things that are actually the exact strategies they need to regulate themselves in any given situation. So, yeah, so that is certainly a big piece of it too. And then, you talked about the parenting. I think that is really tricky. And I think certainly those of us on this call, I mean, I won't speak for everyone, but I certainly was not raised in a way that was a respectful, it was a very like top down authoritarian, this is the way things are, rewards and punishment, mostly punishments in my case, because I was that kid. But, and so I think it requires a lot of work on the part of parents to question those things and then kind of heal their own trauma so that they can better show up for their kids. So I don't know if I'm giving a good answer. I feel like I'm kind of talking all over the place.
That's how we roll here. It's fine. They all
okay,
know. Good. I mentioned I'm a little differently wired, so I'll go down 8,000 rabbit trails and I'll be happy with that. So it's all good. Yes, parents need to be working on their own trauma for sure. That's the thing that I've learned. My son is my biggest teacher in all of this, is that I can't do parenting well, and I can't do it at all until I have regulated my own body, my own brain. Just can't. If I'm not getting good sleep, if I'm not doing all the self-care things and the self-compassion things and all of the, now I'm adding more meditation, more of the like really more holistic health, well-being, not just doing my self-care and checking off a list, right? All those things are so essential for families, and it's not always that easy to do that when you have a child who's intense. They're intense because that's the way they are, and that's great as an adult, right? Some of the qualities that they have, I always say, my son, he's never been formally diagnosed autistic. I think he might qualify for some, I don't know, but it's hard to get a good assessment because he's also profoundly deaf. So, and he's from another country, and so he just doesn't test well on anything, so it's hard to get a good like formal anything kind of diagnosis. but he has, I guess what Christy Forbes is a PDAer. He's definitely demand avoidant, and I think it's probably pathological. And
Mhm.
so that's great. Adults who have strong personalities and are very, what's the new word they're using for that? Pervasive demand for autonomy, right? He
Yeah.
wants to have
Yeah, there's a
autonomy.
lot of different ways to
Yeah,
interpret
it
PDA for
can be
sure.
a strength. He wants it to be the way that's going to work for him, and if it's not going to
Mhm.
work for him, he's not going to do it. You know, and
Yeah.
that's an incredible leadership skill once you get to a certain age. But as a child, it doesn't work
Yeah.
with people that are in charge.
Yeah. That's what I before I left Amsterdam, I was able to do a talk at TEDx Amsterdam, and that was my focus, was that we really, we make heroes out of the disruptors and technology and innovation and industry disruptors, but
Right.
it's the kids who are disruptors that become those people. So how do we make sure that we don't, crush those instincts or kind of try to behavior them out of questioning everything and being a nonconformist person?
And if schools are set up with codes of conduct that squash out every little bit of quote defiance, which I
Mhm.
tell people when my son looks defiant to you, he's actually terrified. He's not
Mm,
being defiant. He's in fight, flight, or freeze, and it's not,
yeah.
as Ross Green says, it's not a won't, it's a can't, right?
Yes.
He's not
Yeah.
doing it on purpose, but it took me some time to figure that out. I went through
Hmm.
that whole early, parenting stage of I have no idea what I'm doing. And then I realized, oh, he's just really scared.
Hmm.
He's not a monster. He might look like
Yeah.
one in this moment, but he's not. He really is just terrified. So
And
yeah,
that's where the work of, I know you guys had Mona Delahooke on. That's one of the things I love about her work so much is she, people ask her, when I had her on the podcast, I asked her as well, like, you know, really though, like some of this behavior is manipulative, right? And she will say there's such a small fraction that is actually a willful choice. Like even if it's something they were able to do 2 days ago and they can't, it's
yeah,
because of where they are in that moment. It's not,
yeah.
yeah, it's a good thing to remember.
They all know what I'm doing. So our model here is instead of being a pyramid and being very linear, it's a spiral. And kids go up and down the spiral and around, and it feels like we're
Mhm.
going in circles and they're getting worse, but they're actually going up. We
Oh,
just
I
don't
love
see
that.
it goes up and down. It's a more human kind of a model. But I use
Hmm.
that to just explain to parents that you're going to have good days and bad days, and it's not because you did it wrong or because the child's never going to get better or whatever.
Right.
It's having a
Yeah.
bad day. And parents, adults go through that too. Like we forget that we're not perfect all day long either. So why do we
Well,
expect
I do not forget that, but yeah.
so
I'm living
yeah.
it to give it right now, I'll tell you.
Oh goodness, yeah. Progress, not perfection, right? Just
Yes,
progress. That's what
exactly.
we're asking for. So yeah, let's see here. So toxic stress, medical stress, other kinds of, oh, and so the pandemic, there's that too, right? So we have
Yeah.
other kinds of um, environmental things and global
Yes.
things and structural.
Existential, right? These kids are often very deep feelers, deep thinkers. And so the existential angst and depression and anxiety is very real. Socially, right now, too, I think there's social trauma, especially, differently wired kids tend to be lagging, right? And their social awareness of their social emotional development. And so these are kids who already may be struggling or um, just having trouble connecting. And so now they've lost this time. Maybe they've connected online, but now they're back in school and nobody knows how to interact. And then you have all these kids who, over the past few years have been developing their identities virtually, which is not how teens and young people are supposed to kind of figure out who they are. And so, um, I just feel so much for kids today, because of all kids, because of the pandemic, and differently wired kids, especially. I feel my heart just goes out to them because they've
It's
lost important time, And when things don't go well socially, or your life isn't unfolding the way you were expecting or hoping it to be, that can be another form of trauma for sure.
And you mentioned the technological, the importance of technology for so many of our differently wired kids.
Mhm.
That's how they connect. Some of them, that's their place where they feel they can be themselves. They can have
Mhm.
strengths if they're good at certain games or they're good at things online. They feel they don't have to be that social awkwardness of having people look at me. Hero, my son Hero, is very nervous about having people look at him. He's deaf, and he's given me permission to share all this. So, but he's deaf, and he goes online, and nobody knows he's deaf. So he doesn't have to worry about whether they know sign language or not. So there's
Mhm.
all these different layers that in some ways it's really opened up social opportunities
Mhm.
for him. And I think a
Mhm.
lot of our differently wired kids, that's where they feel strong. I mean, if
Mhm.
it were up to him, he would just live in that fantasy world all day long every day because it's
Mhm.
easier.
Mhm.
But it's
Yeah.
hard than when they
Yeah.
have to do real world things. So
Yeah, for sure. And certainly there were a number of differently wired kids, not the majority, but there were a lot of kids who were like, this remote schooling thing is awesome, because suddenly they didn't have to deal with all the angst of all those social interactions and the unpredictability of being in a classroom with so many kids whose behavior, who knows what they're going to do. And so kind of always being in that kind of fight
yeah,
or flight mode. Yeah.
and for us, my son and I were already kind of in this sort of bubble before the pandemic because of some of his medical issues that he's been going through. And so really it felt like the whole world came online with us. Then when the pandemic hits, it's like, oh, they're all online with us. This is
Yeah.
great. So we kind of got excited, and now they're all leaving. It's like, oh no, don't go.
Yeah.
Stay. All the conferences are in person now, and like, oh, all the online
Yeah.
things that were available to some, even to adults. It was fun. I could meet people from all over the world and not have to leave home. So
Well, I will share that, I mentioned I homeschooled from third through eighth grade. And so all of that, the Netherlands is not really into homeschooling.
mm,
Like when I would tell people, they're like, I'm sorry, we don't approve of that. Like they were not into it. And it's really hard. I had to jump through a lot of hoops to get
mm,
approval to do that. But
mhm.
so all of the schooling was virtual, and our community, Asher's community, was very small because it was expats and they were always moving and going back to their respective countries. And so our social world got smaller and smaller. So we moved back to the US, and we're in New York City now, and decided together it's time to go back to a school. We're still in a very alternative school, so it's not typical in any way, but you know there we were a couple months later doing it all. Oh my gosh, I'm like, we've done this for the past 7 years, and now we're going back to virtual learning. So it was a real little soul crushing in
Yeah.
my house for sure.
And then the adjustment, like it's just so hard for some kids to adjust to the change. Any kind of
Yeah.
change to their routine can be a lot, but that's a massive change. I mean, I think we
Yes.
all experience that, but especially our kids who
Yeah.
depend on their friends, like they need their friends.
Hmm.
That's the age
Hmm.
of social
Yeah.
time.
Yeah.
So, well, let's shift it a little bit to what we do want to do with our kids and what we can do
Hmm.
to really be positive and encouraging and empowering with them. And we have tons of acronyms and models and frameworks and things that we use here. One of our acronyms is the CARE acronym. So in Heartstrong, CARE stands for compassion,
Hmm.
autonomy, reciprocity, and empowerment. So talk to me a little bit about, and I feel like those are the things that can help us bring kids, to help them heal from the overwhelm that trauma can be, and then also to help them find their way, find their path, their own journey, which
Hmm.
isn't going to be linear, but we can just help them find that path. So what are some things that you would recommend for parents and educators of differently wired kids to build that compassion, autonomy, reciprocity, and empowerment?
Yeah. I love that. I have a couple things for each of those, because I was giving this some thought before the call. I mean, with regards to the compassion, I think first of all, it's really important that we practice our own self-compassion. I think that that's where a lot of my work is involves supporting parents in doing their own deep inner work. And there's so much guilt or just neglect of our own emotional journeys. And so I don't think we can be really vulnerable in the way that we want to be as parents and with our kids, and compassionate in the way that we want to be with our kids and with others who interact with our kids, if we're not being self-compassionate. So I think that's really important, that just doing your own work. And there's no shortage of opportunities to do that. So we, if we decide to do that, we should have a steady supply of opportunities to dive in. And then, also with the compassion piece, and this probably fits into many of these different buckets, but I think just really empathizing with our kids. And that's something I really have learned so much also from Tina Payne Bryson. I love the way, her book, The Power of Showing Up. I just loved her message so much. I had her on the show. I listened to that podcast sometime over and over again because I get something from it every time. But how important it is to just validate our kids' experience and validate, and empathize. I think, that is, to me, so important, that we just don't minimize what our kids are going through, and that we show up for them in a way that we don't, put our own fear or our own, baggage around it into that dynamic.
Yeah. And I so agree with you. I don't know if you're familiar with Kristen Neff's work on self-compassion.
Oh yeah.
She's phenomenal, but we talk about this quite a bit because I feel like the self-care piece can't happen without the self-compassion, because if you're just doing self-care as a thing to do, it doesn't go deep enough.
Right.
But yeah, just showing up and just having that empathy and compassion and understanding that even though it seems like a little thing to us, for that child, it might mean they might actually feel like they're going to die if you make them do the thing, or don't let them not do the thing, whatever the thing is that you're trying to fix in this child. They really feel like they're going to die. And this is what some parents don't understand. Like, it really is fight or flight or freeze. Like, it's that whole tiger is coming after them. They feel that. And so until they feel that sense of safety, we can't have those really high expectations. We have to create that safety for them. Really beautiful. Thank you.
Yeah. And I, as you're saying that, I'm just thinking about how important it is, again, that we do our own work, because just in my experience, and I know this isn't unusual, but I certainly grew up with that authoritarian father where I wasn't allowed to express anger, even though anger was expressed a lot by my dad, but I was not allowed to express it. And so I am so good at either, shoving mine down or exploding, or being super uncomfortable with other people's anger. And so for me, that has been a big part of my work, is to learn to be comfortable with my kids' anger and know that it's appropriate in the situation or whatever, and just hold the space and not get kind of sucked into or enmeshed with that experience. So I think the more we can always be curious about why we're being triggered, I think is really important.
Yes, because all those little ages inside us don't go away, right? I mean, internal family systems, there's so many, right? What we're understanding now about trauma is that almost everybody's walking around with childhood adversity of some kind, but they may not have processed that, and it's how we perceive what has happened. So I often will tell people ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, leave what I call traces, which are traumatic responses to adverse childhood experiences, right? So ACEs leave traces. Not everybody who goes through an adverse childhood experience is going to have trauma. Some children are, and it could be two different siblings in the same family that experience the same adversity. Every child's going to process that differently. So there are some children who, because they're differently wired, because they're highly sensitive, because they're, for whatever reason, they may be processing it and taking on the burden and thinking that it's their fault or whatever the thing is. So that trauma, it could be very pervasive and people might not even realize that they have
Yeah.
that. And so then they're parenting a child and all of a sudden all those things are triggered. So important to explore those things. Really good.
Are you familiar with Dr. Anne Louise Lockhart's work?
No, I'm not, but tell me. See,
She
I'm back and listen to this recording, write down all the books and add them to our list.
yeah.
We have an ever-growing list.
I always do that when I have conversations. I'm like, oh, you got to read this.
I know. Well, this is how, and I'll just tell you really quick, the book club is not a traditional book club because I couldn't pick a book. I'm like, there's too many. So I call it a buffet book club. So it's BYOB, bring your own book, and we do it by theme. So we have a different theme every month. And everybody's reading a different book, but then we can talk about the themes. So that way I wasn't under the pressure, like I can't just do that book, I have to do this book too. So we have like 20 books a month they can pick from under a theme. But
that's great. I love that. That's really smart.
Yeah.
Well, Dr. Lockhart, she does not have a book she has a self-published book on ADHD, but she's a psychotherapist, trauma informed, and I just had her on my show a few months ago to talk about breaking generational trauma cycles. And it was such a fascinating conversation. And just how important.
Go on the podcast and listen. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I would tell you the episode number, but I don't remember what it was. But she has a rockin' Instagram presence too. But anyway, it was just a really fascinating conversation about just how important it is that we stop the cycle. And she's so passionate about helping families do that work. And it also, again, it just requires a willingness to go there, which some people just don't want to do, right?
Well, and one of the required books in our program is My Grandmother's Hands by Resmaa Menakem. Have you heard of his?
Yeah, I have heard of it. I haven't read it.
It's gorgeous. It's about racialized trauma in the United States, but really it's a global thing, right? He talks about white body supremacy and how these are things we don't even realize that we're swimming in all day long, every day. And so as teachers who teach multiple races and cultures, as parents who are adoptive parents, some of us are, we have transracial adopted children, all of these things are there. And if we don't explore them, we're going to step in it. Like we're going to say something that's going to trigger something.
Yep.
We need to be aware of those little microaggressions that are happening all day long to our kids. So, yeah. Absolutely. So, oh my goodness. So I'm watching the time, but keep going. We'll go for a few more minutes and then I'll open up to questions.
Okay. Yeah. Well, just thinking about the autonomy piece. I mean, I see this as really, I think it's so important. This is something I talk a lot about in my community, is just to seeing our kids as creative, resourceful, whole beings. And I think that is not, I mean, for any parent, it's not really the lens through which most parents are raising their kids. And I think when we are too attached to who they are or what their journey looks like or what our role is in their life, that we can, kind of stay tangled up in trauma. So just like really being able to see them, no matter how they're wired, they are their own unique individual being on their journey. We have the honor of guiding, shepherding, supporting, loving these humans. But I think that that's really important. So, focusing on a respectful relationship is just so important. Listening to what our kids say, I talk a lot about becoming fluent in our kids' language. That's one of the tilts in my book. And I think, and obviously, you talked about ESL, like I'm just, our kids are communicating to us, as we know, through everything that they do. But that I see that really as our job is to always be evolving our translation dictionary for how they're communicating their needs, their fears, their emotions, their everything, and anticipating and just observing and noticing what's going on with them, I think is really, it's just really important. Yeah, I'm gonna stop.
So much trauma is pre-verbal too, that a lot of the techniques that I teach parents is because of my experience with having a deaf child who I couldn't talk to when he was having a meltdown. But those techniques and the strategies to really getting that language, it's not a verbal, it's all body language and how they're standing and how they're looking at you and where you're standing, and all these things are so primal, but they're so important to be aware of. So thanks for mentioning that.
Yeah, I mean, one of the examples I have is that what I would notice when I was homeschooling, if Ash, like at 3 p.m, came down wearing pajamas, I was like, oh, okay, it's that kind of a day. You've had a rough day. You need cozy. You need to just check out right now. That was just a little example, but we can learn a lot if we get curious about them. And then with the last thing I'll just share is with the empowerment piece. I don't know if these are fitting in, but I thought about all your acronym, but that we want to be scaffolding, and that goes in with the fluency piece, but really getting so attuned to where they are and things that can be hard for them, letting them know that we have their back and supporting them, but also respecting that they're on their own growth, their own developmental timeline. And so that just requires so much awareness and presence of who they are. And again, showing up with curiosity always, and not having these kind of arbitrary demands or expectations about where they should be or what this should look like, but rather just showing up for who they are today in this moment and being present for that. So those are a lot of the things that I kind of think about when I think about how to best show up for who our kids are.
Yes, and those are hard things to do because there's so much pressure put on us, I think, by society and by schools, and by standards or whatever, core curriculum, whatever. There's so much out there that's telling us that our kids aren't measuring up. Right? And so they're internalizing that too. They know if they're in the stupid kid class. I mean, you can call it the blueberries and strawberries or whatever you want to call it, but they're going to know. They pick up on this. So we need to be really aware of what kind of expectations we're putting on our kids that they're internalizing, right? And just letting them be proud of who they are and shine for finding that diamond, finding that beautiful, brilliant diamond that's in the rough that maybe not everybody sees yet. So
and really going with looking for their strengths, helping identify their strengths, helping, I don't, same way that I'm not a big, rewards and punishments. I'm also not like a empty praise kind of a person, but noticing strengths and wow, I'm so curious what inspired you to transcribe that song. That my brain doesn't work that way. How did that happen? Those kinds of things to help our kids really get to understand who they are, right, and where their strengths lie. I think can be so important because it's through those strengths and it's through those interests that's where everything can open up for them. So, and since a lot of times school is not the place where those strengths are going to be, be able to naturally blossom, I think that as parents and caregivers, it's a big part of our job is to support growth in those areas.
Absolutely. And I won't go into my story about the art class, but you all know my story. That
you have one of those too?
My son's
mine was an art camp, but
an artist, and they had no art class in his grade level at his special school, and it was a disaster. But anyway, he's doing a whole lot of art now, so we're good. But and that whole idea of not doing empty praise, I really like that too. The way we do it here is we call it optimistic narratives of growth. So we explicitly point out to kids how they've grown, and we name where they were because they don't remember. We say, remember when you used to throw things at me for 5 hours? Wow, you only did it for 15 minutes. That's awesome. High five. Why can't we be excited about that they only threw the plates for 15 minutes? It's a good thing. It's growth. And so really reframing that it's not an either or. It's not this child's a bad child, this child's a good child. This is a growing child. This is a child who was here a week ago and they're here now, or a year ago, wherever it was. I'm really pointing that out to the child, and our kids need to hear that. The kids that are really struggling.
1,000%.
do that. Well, this, I know we could go on for hours, but I do want to make sure we give some time to our participants to ask you some questions. So if you'll all do this for me, type the word question before your question so I know it's a question, not just a comment. And I'll look and see if there are any questions already. Let's see here. Go ahead and type them in, and then I'll just select them from there. So type your questions in if you have a question, and then I might call on you to unmute. But before we go ahead and type them in now. And while we're doing that, Debbie, if you'll share with everybody how they can get in touch with you, where you are online, what new events or things that they should look out for that are coming up.
Yeah, so tiltparenting.com is the home, the hub for all of the resources. So if you go to the podcast tab, that's where you can kind of search for things. I've got 290 plus episodes now and cover everything from PDA to trauma to any learning disability you can imagine, and a lot of also parenting, just parenting experiences. So yeah, lots of resources on Tilt, and then all social media is all at Tilt Parenting. And I'll say the thing I have coming up is my favorite part of my work is it's called the Differently Wired Club, and I launched it almost 3 years ago, and it's a community of parents who want to really do the work. And so every month we talk about a theme. Actually, the theme this month is personal self-discovery, and it's been fascinating. But we do live calls, office hours, and coaching calls, and it's so, oh my God, I love it so much because now I get to hang out with all these awesome parents. So I kind of once again created what I needed, and selfishly I gain a lot from that group, but it's a really supportive.
Well, don't we all do that? I created a book club because I was like, I need to read these books, so I might as well read them with other people, right? So
that's what we do.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you so much. So yeah, everybody go check out all of Debbie's stuff. If you haven't read her book yet, you need to, Differently Wired. Check that out, and let me check the chat and see what questions we have. Just keep them coming, and I will read them. And generational trauma. So Julie, why don't you unmute and make sure everybody, when you have a question, just keep it really short so that everybody has a chance in case others have questions. Go ahead and unmute, Julie, and you can ask your question.
Okay, well, I just wanted to say thanks to Debbie anyways. It was a great talk, but I just wanted to hear about her experience she had talked about Dr. Lockhart and being kind of connected to that. What was your journey in breaking the generational trauma? Because you kind of alluded to it a little bit with your own family being different, with your father and stuff like that. We might not have time, but I was just very interested in that.
Yeah. I mean, I will say I still think I'm working on it, but I think when I became a parent, I didn't know anything other than I wanted an opposite experience for my child. And so that's where I started, was just like, I'm going to do this and I'm going to do this because that's what I didn't get. And that's what didn't happen for me. And so I think I just had a very kind of knee-jerk reaction and trying to opposite everything. And it's only been really in the past couple of years. And I'm so grateful. I have an older sister who we hated each other growing up, and we are the best of friends now. I don't know what my life would be without her, but we're processing together, and it's been fascinating because it just happened yesterday. We'll be having a conversation about something, and she'll have a completely different something, that she held on to. I'm like, I had no idea that even happened, and vice versa. And so we're kind of uncovering things for each other, and that has just been really helpful for me to just know that it's there. And for me, once I kind of bring light to it, it just kind of it releases something. So I haven't, my sister has been doing IFS and like really processing stuff. I think her experience has been, was more intense than mine. So I kind of maybe piggyback off of the work that she's doing, but but I tend to, once I kind of make a discovery or connection, it really kind of loosens something for me. And and it allows me to just even show up in a more meaningful way as a parent. So it's been really interesting. Like I'm so grateful that I have my sister to process this with.
It's so funny that you say that because that's almost exactly what my sister and I are dealing with right now. I have one sibling and I'm the one that's doing all the work and she's the one that I'm like, "Oh, you need to read this book. Oh, I just read Brené Brown. You got to read this. Oh, you got to go see Encanto by Disney. It's all about generational trauma, right?"
It's a good book
So
or a good movie. Yeah.
she watched it. She's like, "I'm Louisa. I'm the one that feels under pressure." Like, I know. And so yeah, it's funny. Isn't that funny? But as adults, now that we can process it, and then what I'm learning is that there's this wise inner self that can step back from all those little selves, those little small selves in us that are traumatized by things. There's a wise self that steps back and can see it and observe it. But as children,
Yes.
we don't have access to that yet. And so that's why children think that there's something wrong with them, because
Right.
they're processing and interpreting the world differently than the way adults do. So it's really fascinating.
I'll add one more thing too. I don't know, this just popped up in what you were saying, but Julie, I really focus on repairing things with my child too, right? And that helps me heal, because something, there way too much to go into now, but I'll just say that, my child was experiencing trauma from the repatriation and all kinds of stuff that that was out of their control. And I remember my sister said to me, "What if you just apologized? Like think about if mom or dad had apologized to you for this one thing, what would that have meant to you?" I'm like, "Oh my God, that would have changed everything." And so, like being able to do that is has been so profound in terms of my relationship with my child, but also was very healing for me too. So
Yeah,
I think that repair piece is important.
and then that kind of really segues nicely into Anne's question. I think this is really good. And Anne, you can unmute, but on the other hand, there's always another hand, right? On the other hand, sometimes kids can take over a little bit if we don't stand up for our needs as well, right? So how do we balance that? And Anne, why don't you unmute and you can kind of explain what your question's about. And then we have Sydney has a question too.
Yeah,
just
as
a few more minutes.
as you know, Sandy, I get so am I unmuted?
Yeah, you're good. You're fine.
Okay. I get so into the empathizing and understanding and wanting to find the strengths and all this. I tend to lose my own voice or forget what my own, not just my own needs, but even deeper than that, my own self or my own and what I want to pass on, the positive generational things that the values I might want to, by maybe over empathizing, or it's not even over empathizing, because I don't think I'm actually empathizing as well when I go over that way, when I lose myself. So I just sometimes struggle with, because limit setting it's often just explained in such a more behavioristic kind of, the traditional models of all these limit settings are so behavioristic and authoritarian, and rewards and consequences and all that kind of stuff. And sorry, I'm not being very clear, but I just wonder how in your approach does that fit in? I mean, even like basic things like safety, and you were mentioning about screens at the very beginning, and like, how do you balance, that your own kind of values or with that?
That's a good question. And I mean, I try to center the relationship as opposed to, what my outcome or perceived outcome is in that moment. I try to center the relationship and also zoom out to my bigger goals for this human, which when I can zoom out, it helps me not focus so much on this screen, this what's happening in this moment. And I remember, oh, what I'm doing here is raising someone who I really hope knows themselves so well that they understand where their strengths are and where their own relative weaknesses are, where they might need extra support. And so I'm always kind of thinking, how can I use this challenge or conflict or area of tension as a way to further that bigger goal? So I tend to not get, and in a way that preserves my connection and relationship. So it can be a lot slower of a process to deal with something like limits on things or behavior that is challenging, that, because I'm not focused so much on fixing it right now, but rather, how can I work with this kid to figure this out together in a way that's going to help my child know themselves better and preserve our connection. So, and I'll just tell you, with screen stuff, I gave up with screen limits a long time ago because they were causing so much stress in our family. They were going to take us down. My desire to, and I was doing it the right, I was trying to help my kid understand, how do you feel after you do this, and what's your plan, and all of those things. And finally I was like, you know what, this isn't worth it. And my kid is a tech kid, and I started looking at what is my child doing on screens, as opposed to, what's the quality of the screen time, as opposed to just this kind of screen time. And I found that when I kind of backed off, it helped our relationship, and then that enabled us to have conversations about screen time, and approach it from a more collaborative, I'm a big raw screen fan, so from a more collaborative perspective.
And I
really looking at the why of getting down deep to the why of, so that
and I mean, I'm not gonna disclose anything about your family, but I also think it's important for you to have your needs met too. I'll just say that it's very, very important that it's not just about letting the child grow and giving their strength. I mean, that's a huge part of it, but the parent can't disappear in that. You can't be that can become very abusive when you are so gone because you're just trying to always make sure that he's okay. You have to be strong and be who you are too. And so that's why the collaboration always has the parent concern, right? And Anne's really familiar with raw screen because we've talked about it a lot, but so important. The balance, it's a balance, right? And it's good days and bad days, and it's not perfect. But the self-compassion piece comes in there too, where if you take a minute or take a day or take a week away from him, then you just need to do that. It's okay to do that. You know what I mean? So Debbie, you're gonna do something else.
Well, I was just gonna say, I mean, focusing on relationship, a relationship is between two people. So your needs do have to be met. And I think I don't know your situation, but depending on the age of your kids, how much do you share? How vulnerable do you be? How do you kind of make sure that your child knows that you are a human living your own experience too, and that you need to, whether that's setting boundaries for yourself or whatever that looks like. Absolutely.
Yeah, because kids with trauma can be very, sometimes they can be really mean. I mean, to be quite frank, they're not, because their brains are compromised, they're not able to access the empathy and the compassion for others yet. I always put yet on the end of that because they're going to be able to someday. But right now, in this moment, in this trigger, in this fight, flight, or freeze, because of what they've experienced, they're in their own preservation mode. So what they're doing is, I mean, I was physically attacked. My son was physically attacking me early, and everybody knows our story. And he just microwaved something and walked by. I don't know if you saw him, but he doesn't hear any of this because he's deaf, so it's all cool. He's allowed in and out of all my things I do. But it was tough. It was very dangerous and tough, and so many families and so many, and teachers are dealing with this in the schools too. They don't know what to do. There's massive burnout because of the major meltdowns that are experiencing because of trauma, and they have no idea what to do. So we need a scaffolded approach to that, where it's just about safety and compassion. That's all we start with, and then we build on that. It's hard, and you got to be really well resourced in order to do this work. It's tough.
Yeah.
So tough. But yeah, thank you for asking that question though, Ian. All right, any other, Sydney, was that a question or was it just a comment?
Well, I'm trying to apply this to
This will be our last question because we're going to wrap up here in a minute. Okay.
I'm realizing I teach transitional kindergarten, and it's not pre-K and it's not kinder. It's a kindergarten readiness program, which now is called the Universal TK. That's being rolled out, but California is already doing it. But what I've noticed in my students is I just realized like they haven't been socialized in 2 years. Like they didn't even go to a grocery store. And then we've recently taken off the masks. The kids aren't required to wear them. And so the behavior has, their executive functioning, their self-regulation is non-existent right now. And it's hard. I have meltdowns. I have, they just take, when I give them a free time, a little bit of free choice to explore, and I'm trying to promote social skills, they take it to the top. Like they're pushing, they're hurting each other, and it's not on purpose, right? It's just that they can't. And so I tend to resort to the authoritarian father that I was so wonderfully raised with. And
your question? Did you have a question?
Well, but it was pretty much answered. Preserve the connection. But how do you? My question basically is, what do you suggest, like, to help with this, to start the process of self-regulation? Because it has to be in context. The social emotional learning curriculums they're top down. They're not. And my students, I work in Watts. I don't know if you've heard of it.
Yeah.
Kids are very dysregulated. So like, do you have any recommendation? Like, I get that preserve the connection. I wrote that down. I have to, like, that's my new mantra.
Yeah. I mean, I will just say that I hear from so many people, and I have many friends who are professional therapists working with kids and working in schools. And I just know what our kids are experiencing, especially the little ones. I mean, what you just described is what I feel like is happening everywhere. I mean, what it comes to me is like, play, right? Play is really the work of the child. And we know that like the DIR, floor time, and play-based therapies are relationship based. And so that I would try to incorporate play as much as possible. But I don't have it. I think it's really tough right now.
Yeah, no, and I play with them. That's the other thing. I need to play, like, take moments to just sit and play with them, because I'm lucky it's the last 20 days of school. So that's another thing. It's so hard. Schools, and I've noticed, I would love to visit one of these schools that you mentioned on your website. I was just looking at those. Just hearing it from somebody who's expert is just, it's good to hear that. Just preserve the connection, build the relationship, and do the play. And don't worry about the test scores, because they're already starting to test my students, and it's really, a 5-year-old shouldn't be tested.
It is the worst, our kids and through our teachers. It's just trying to survive to get to the end. And the fact that they're even doing some of the tests right now, what are we testing? Like, I always say it's like taking cookies out of the oven every 5 minutes to see if they're baking. Like, just leave them in the oven, let them bake. Like,
that's a good analogy.
Just give them some time. You're not going to get a good cookie if you're testing all the time. So, Well, listen, we're going to wrap up because we've gone a little over time, but I know we could spend 2 more hours talking about lots of things. But definitely go follow Debbie, follow all her stuff. She's got tons and tons of resources. A lot of these topics she expands upon in some of her other podcast interviews. So go listen to those. I'm sure you can binge listen for hours and enjoy every moment. So I want to say thank you so much, Debbie. This has been wonderful. I really appreciate your time today.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. This was a really interesting conversation. I enjoyed hanging out with you all.
Is there anything else you want to say in closing about what's something we can end on a positive note about our different?
I just love that you're all here. I mean, I just, this work is so important, and I'm so glad that you do the work that you do, Sandy, and that you're all just so invested in this work, because I think now more than ever, it's just so needed. So thank you.
Thank you. And that's why the name of our group is the Trauma Informed Changemakers. We're really, all of us, committed to making a change, not only in our own children, but in the systems and the structures that are out there that aren't serving them. So hopefully you're inspired by some of Debbie's words tonight, and you'll take that with you into your classrooms tomorrow or into your homes tomorrow, and know that what you're doing is making a difference. All right. Thank you so much for being here, everybody. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.